This week on the Sports Initiative podcast, I sit down with Director of Rugby at Italian side Pesaro, Nick Scott. He discusses his transition into rugby and why having an alternative background may have been of use to him, his lived experience in Italy, and how this has developed him as a practitioner, as well as some of the strategies he has used in team and squad creation. As always, if you enjoy this podcast, please make sure you share it with friends and family. I hope you enjoy. Perfect. Yeah, we're good to go. So, Nick, I know we've caught up off air a little bit. Probably one of the more cultured pre podcast meetings. A little bit discussion around Italian wine and stuff. So you're making me very envious. But how are things your end? All okay?
Oh, good. Sun shining. It's a bit warm at the moment, but we're on the coast here, so it's there's a nice fresh sea breeze as well from the Adriatic. It's all good here, thank you.
Perfect. So, if you could just give everyone a little bit of a brief description about who you are and what you do, I think that'd be a really nice starting point for the podcast.
Okay, so if I go back to where I started and also the kind of feeling of self that I have, I'm a farmer's boy from Lincolnshire. But as a family, we were all obsessed by sport. My brother played professional cricket for Notts and Durham for 18, 20 years and went on into a great coaching career at Cambridge University, director of cricket there. My other brother, has played sport all his life. So we were a sporting family on the farm. I did a degree in economics at Newcastle University and went and worked on the farm, but also played rugby in the amateur days of rugby union, and went into coaching when I finished playing. And the precarious nature of farming, my farm flooded one year 2000, and there was a job going at the RFU for 3 months. So a friend of mine in the village, actually, Dusty Hare, ex-British Lion, said, you might as well have a go for that because you're not going to do any farming for the next 3 months or have any income for the next 3 months. So I became a rugby development officer for Leicestershire temporarily. Really enjoyed it. And when the job was advertised nationally, I took the job as RDO for Leicestershire. But always coaching was my first love. As a development officer, it was always about player development, coach development, referee development, club development. And when a guy called Evan Crawford came from New Zealand to set up the coaching department, I became one of the first 4 coaching development officers for the RFU, which is a great privilege. Did that for a couple of years, 3 or 4 years. And then I became the national coaching development manager. Evan had moved on and the structure changed a little bit. So I became national coaching development manager in 2009. And I carried that through. My responsibility there was for everything technical from level 1, tag rugby, level 1 through to level 4 premiership coaches, right the way through the system. Brexit came along, which I was completely disgusted by, and I thought, I can't breathe the same air as Boris Johnson. So I decided to move out to Italy. 2018, I became director of rugby at Rugby Colorno near Parma. And we were in what's called the Eccellenza. The top is called the Seria Elite now. Had 3 years there. First year was great. Second year was stopped in February because of COVID and the CAP Championship suspended. And then the third year there, again, Christmas, they suspended the championship because of COVID. Because where I was right in the epicenter of where COVID really started in Italy. It was pretty frightening, to be perfectly honest. And then after that period of reflection, time in my life, I thought, well, changing lifestyle, I'll go out to the coast. So at a Seria A club called Pesaro, and I'm director of rugby there.
Perfect. Yeah, I think obviously loads of bits for us to dive into. I think if we start at the beginning, what drew you to rugby in particular? So yeah, what was it that resonated with you when you decided to take that initial job from farming and going on a 3 month sabbatical, or when you were a kid and you wanted to go and play plenty of sports? What was it that drew you to rugby in particular?
Um, in farming, the hours are long and the rewards aren't always fantastic. Um, I think that's where the basis of my coaching philosophy came from. Farming is about patience. You put a seed in the ground, or we had sheep, you can't shout at a lamb and get it to grow. You have to surround it with the right environment, nurture it, right food, the right grass, the right field, the right everything, and then trust that it will grow. And I think that kind of um, uh, that kind of background enabled me to have the patience, or to be the type of coach that I am. Not every coach is like that, obviously, but to be the type of coach I am, controlling the controllables. And in farming, there were so many uncontrollables. Um, the weather, the supermarkets, the commodity prices. You learn not to worry about them because there's not a lot you can do about it. So going into coaching, and as I said, the farm had flooded when I went into join the RFU. It was more controllable. There were more things that I could control. Still a whole heap load of things you can't control in coaching, but it felt more something that I could have an influence on and work with. So it was a big jump. I kept the farm. We rent the farm out, but it was a big jump. But it's one I haven't regretted a single day.
Yeah, and when you discuss I guess going into that role, you mentioned it was a development one, in particular in the local region, and that then became broader. For you, who um, come from, I guess, a slightly more untraditional background initially of farming and then going through into that pathway, what were some of the biggest challenges that you found either trying to develop the game within Leicestershire, or when it then went nationally, when you're trying to develop it nationally?
So there's some challenges for me initially. Were that, as you say, I came from an unconventional background, and everybody else was a teacher or had teacher training. In those days, the sports degrees weren't quite so established, but everybody came from a certain background, and understanding some of the language around coaching at the time, to me as a farmer, seemed unnecessarily complicated. And it was breaking through some of that stuff to um, to realize that intuitively I actually did know some of this stuff. I just couldn't articulate it particularly well. So that was a personal barrier that I had. The second thing, certainly in rugby union, I can't talk about other sports, but rugby was moving from the amateur period pre-95 into the coaching, into the professional era, and coaching almost took it for granted that the players, particularly the newly professional players, were fully rounded characters. Because previous to that, people like, let's go in Leicestershire, Martin Johnson, they'd had a job and they'd had to turn up for work, and Neil Back and people like that had to turn up for work and cope with their everyday lives and their rugby. When the game became professional, there was a focus solely on technical and tactical things. And in the academies in particular, I felt, well, no, I didn't necessarily feel it at the time, but looking back, there was a lack of focus on developing the person, on the holistic. These guys came straight from very often private schools, didn't really know how to look after themselves, and then were put into a world where they trained in the morning and then went online gaming or gambling, online poker, something like that in the afternoon, and were just left to their own devices. So the biggest challenge in terms of professional players was this gradual realization about the importance of developing the person as well as the player. I think that's pretty well taken for granted now, but at that time it wasn't. There was a focus just on gym, technical, tactical. For the wider game, as a development officer, the adult game was in crisis then. And mini rugby was growing almost exponentially. And one of the challenges we had to deal with was the mini rugby game. Everybody was really competitive. And by the time a kid reached 18, if they weren't going to play professional, they'd already had a 10-year rugby career and were ready to do something else. And very few of them were going on into adult rugby. And that was a function of the environment that was created at mini rugby level. So that was another key challenge that we had to face.
What do you mean by that, by the function of the environment?
Squads being lots and lots of tournaments, which became festivals, but were still tournaments in effect, with a cup at the end of it and a player of the match, and teams picking, leaving kids at home, not playing kids all through the season because they didn't quite make the cut. And there are lots and lots of stories in rugby particularly in rugby actually, of players who were physically awkward at 10 years old, but if people stuck with them, became good athletes older. But also, it was quite high pressure for the kids. You see kids. I remember there's a couple of things changed me. I remember arriving at a tournament as it finished, and a car leaving with mum, the hooter blasting, with mum holding the cup out the window, dad blasting the hooter, and the two kids in the back eating chips. That I just thought that's a bit strange. The other story is the rugby league story about the guy, ex-professional international rugby league player in Australia, who went to a festival and he watched the kids play. There was a squad of about 20, 10 on the pitch at any one time. Coaches were allowed on the pitch, and the coaches were moving the players around on the pitch like chess pieces. And then he looked behind the lads who were not playing, and they just set up a game, adapted. There was a tree in the way, so they played around the tree. Some of them were bigger than the others because they were mixed age. The lads who were left over were mixed age. So you could only a big lad touch and it was tackled, but the others could be tackled. They made their own rules up. And this ex-professional player said he looked and these kids were just giggling and having a whale of a time. And then he looked in the organised game where they had to go on, and they just changed completely. And they were crying, they were scared, they were like robots. So those are a couple of things that really made me question the environment we had at that time in junior rugby.
And so I guess part of your role would have been looking to try and change that and making it an environment more conducive to ultimately long-term love of the game by the sounds of it, because you want people that, when they get to 18 go, yeah, I want to do that next step. It doesn't matter if that's playing for Leicester Tigers or whether that's playing for Ronald McDonald's pub team just down the road, but I do it because of my love of the game and love of people and players around it. So how did you go around doing that? What was the framework that the NGB put in place to try and shift that narrative and the idea of lifelong love of the game?
So initially, as a development officer, you just have to be what you want to be, what you want to see. You have to, when you get over competitive people complaining about this referee at a festival and arguing that this happened hasn't happened or that hasn't happened, you just have to exhibit the behaviours that you want to see in them with patience and authenticity and create a bit of trust. As a lone development officer in a county, you have to create an element of trust that you're doing the right thing for the right reasons, and that you grow a little bit of trust. As a coach development officer, we got it was regional, and we got a bit more a greater ability to influence the coaching materials first of all that went out. So we wrote some of the old level one, or we contributed to some of the old level one and level two, and worked on that, as well as having a greater influence on the, specifically on the coaches around us, which helped. The way I did that was, as a coach development officer, was identify. It's like being a coach with players. You identify the right people with who you feel, who you get on with, and who you feel you share the same values, and empower them to identify the right people. You grow a network without having to be the one who is seen everywhere. I've always been uncomfortable with being the center of attention. I'd much rather just let other people, quietly speak to other people, quietly influence other people, and let them take the benefit, take the glory, if you like, for what they do. As national manager, I rewrote the level one to start with, and kind of Jean Cote was a Canadian academic, and he talked about, and also other people talked about the 5 C's, not just developing the technical, tactical, physical, but also the character of people. And there was competence, confidence, connection, character became the core of our level one offer, and then level two offer. We did a little task at the start of them. We asked coaches to these are community coaches, to identify the best player they've ever coached, and then write, not their name, but think of the best player you've ever coached, and then what made them the best player you've ever coached. And actually 90%, 99% of the coaches wrote down a whole load of things that weren't technical or tactical. They were about the person. So we said, right, well, we're on the same wavelength here, because you've just identified yourself that these are the key things about coaching, not technical, tactical stuff. Then a couple of people really influenced me, and I got on really well with, was John Fletcher, who's gone up to Scotland now, and Russell Earnshaw and Pete Walton as well, Rick Shuttleworth, and then at the elite level, Kevin Bowring. They were all we were quite a close team. There was a close team to work with technically, which we all came from a similar standpoint, and we all added slightly different things. So it was quite a long pathway really to get to where it took 10 years to get to where it was.
Yeah, you've named a few former guests there, and I can confirm the interactions I've had with them, it has been equally insightful, and as you said, in terms of what they're looking to do, which is really good. How do you go around challenging, I guess, challenging those long held views? Because if you do that's but from what it sounds like is those behaviors or those ideas are pretty well ingrained at that point in terms of having lots of festivals and lots of tournaments. It's probably where a lot of the senior players at that point have grown up playing through. So some of the names you mentioned earlier, like your Martin Johnsons, your Neil Backs, etc., have probably come through a similar pathway. How do you go around challenging that um, from a structural point of view? You've mentioned about having that network, but there obviously becomes a point where you're going, right, we're going to shift course here and we're going to shift what we do from a festival point of view or a game format point of view or whatnot. So how did you go around actually delivering that to coaches and to clubs to say this is the direction we want to move into, along with the rationale why of what you've just explained?
Working really hard on personal influence, lots and lots. It works really well in here in Italy. Actually, lots of coffees, lots of chats, lots of informal discussions away from the course or away from meetings, but just over a beer or over a coffee. I think that's important. Also, I was lucky enough to have coached at every level. So I've done mini rugby. I've done youth rugby for a number of years. I'm an old man. I've been around a long time. I usually knew somebody. I got it to myself to the point where I knew somebody who knew somebody. So I could always quote experiences. I could always quote other people. But it's that whole, you've got to be authentic in yourself. You've got to be able to, as the old saying, if you can't explain it in a sentence, you probably don't understand it fully yourself. So you have to have thought things through. A lady called Penny Crisford pointed this out to me. When I first became national manager, one of my challenges was I would spend a long time working something out. And then when I worked it out, I used to get frustrated that other people couldn't see it, forgetting how long it had taken me to see it. So empathy for the listener, finding points in their language, using their words, shape shifting. I don't know if you've heard of shape shifting, but shape shifting is the sounds a little bit strange, but the Native Americans, when they used to go out to hunt caribou or bison, used to live like a bison for a couple of days, dressed in the skin and track them and live like them so that they could fully understand how to hunt them. For me, it's not exactly hunting, but immersion in somebody else's environment for a little while, a bit of research into where they're coming from, finding out keywords, key motivations, was really important in influencing people. And then ultimately, it was very rarely Nick Scott's idea. It was an idea that they'd come to and I'd been a part of. So the way rugby was organised, there were council members and there were key people in every constituent body, in every area around the country. And it was a question of that process with those people so that the power of persuasion eventually gets them to where we need to be.
How did you develop those soft skills? Because that sounds like obviously you as a person being really skillful to go and speak to these people and over a period of time have dialogue that allows them to come to a realization that there might be a slightly better avenue they can go down. But I can imagine from experiences I've had in the sporting world that could have just as easily gone the other way, where they take exception to something you say, or you come across disingenuous because you're having all these conversations in different areas. So it's actually quite a skill to be able to do that. So where did you learn those soft skills?
How do I learn the skills? I have absolutely no idea. I was the first person from my family to go to university, and I think at university you learn strategic and critical thinking. Economics was a completely different discipline. Maybe I learned it there. Um, Maybe hours and hours on a tractor, 12 hours a day on a tractor alone. You um, you do think about a lot of things, and you can think yourself into a really good place or a really bad place, and you think through, you reflect on conversations that you've had as well. So I was coaching at the time while I was working, and yeah, you spend a lot of time reflecting and analysing conversations you've had. Um, the thing about coming across as disingenuous is really valid. You can't say, you have to be authentic. You can't say one thing to one person and another thing to another person. The message has to be consistent, but the speed and um, the language you use around the message, it's just like players. Some people want it direct, other people want it less direct, and it's about having an empathy for the person you're talking to. I think recognizing, first of all, recognizing who you're talking to, and then having an empathy for them. I mean, that's been ramped up massively since I moved to Italy.
Well, I think this is a really nice segue actually, because I was going to say to you that segue across. So obviously you mentioned earlier around what I agree with you was a very interesting decision to be part of Brexit. Um, from your perspective, you mentioned to make the jump across. What was the initial point to say, yeah, I'm going to do it? And then how did the opportunity actually come around in terms of being in a position to move across to Italy and take over a club and do some work, etc.
Um, I, uh, I'm always afraid, not afraid. I've always been a little bit. I've enjoyed being out of my comfort zone, and if things become too regular and straightforward, and almost, it was never formulaic with the RFU, but if I become feeling comfortable, I get a little bit restless. Um, Also financially, clearly the RFU was I was really kind of proud of what we'd built from 2000 to about 2016 at the RFU, a network of rugby development officers, coach, community rugby coaches, a big staff, and there was a feeling we were going to lose a lot of those, and I didn't really fancy um, being expected to have the same impact with a staff that was ultimately cut down by about 200, I guess. It just didn't feel. So I got to 58 years old, and it just didn't feel like something that I fancied starting building all over again. Um, Italy, I've always been across. A very good friend who's not ever so well at the moment, but Andrew Jepson, who's worked over here for probably 25, 30 years. And I used to come across and visit Jeppo. Um, there's a rugby club in the Veneto in Padua, where my son went and played a little bit over there when he was 18. Um, we've always been a little bit curious as a family, and I was curious to see what it would be like. I mean, I wrote and ran the director of rugby course for the RFU, and I used to stand there and talk to directors of rugby and realize actually I haven't actually done that. Here I am kind of being what I sometimes despise, being academic about something that I haven't actually done. So I had a real sense of what's it like to actually do it. And then not only I could have done it somewhere in England, but the next stage was to do it in a language and in a culture and in a environment that I would have to get to understand. Um, so it just became a kind of a bit of a can I, could I, should I? Yeah, go on then. I'll give it a go. And the RFU were fantastic. They offered me a sabbatical to be able to go and give it a go. But at the end of the sabbatical, I decided that, Italy was the way the UK was going. Italy was probably a more exciting place. It also feels here as though a little bit like it was in the early 2000s. We're pushing back barriers. There are still things to be achieved here. There's still new things to do. So that was exciting.
So I think linking back to what you said around, delivering to directors of rugby or future directors of rugby to then actually being in the role, what would you say was the biggest difference of perception from yourself? So obviously, like you mentioned, sometimes in academia or sometimes on these courses, there's a perception of what the role is going to deliver or how you have to deliver it. And then when you're actually in the role, you have to act in a different way, or there's some different challenges that maybe you weren't aware of. Was there anything in particular that stood out that was massively different to the content you were delivering on the course?
Um, I guess first challenge was language. I didn't speak hardly any Italian when I came across, and very few of those. We had in the first team we had a South African coach, Samoan, a couple of South African players. So we had some English speakers who helped me enormously. But I and there were a couple of people. There's a guy called Ty Seria who worked with at the RFU, who was very good, and David Lind, an Irish guy who lived in Italy, who backed me up hugely. But the biggest challenge I found in a club was Colorno is one of the most unique, fantastic clubs. I was director of rugby over a fully professional team playing at the top level. We had a women's team who were champions of Italy with probably 7 or 8 international players playing really good stuff. Now there's a difference between a fully professional men's team and a semi-professional women's team, which is a DOR you have to compartmentalize in your mind. We had under 18s right the way down to under 6s, and I was responsible for the coach development and the strategy. Again, understanding what success was, and more importantly, getting the coaches to understand what success was at each of those levels was really, really mind blowing. I used to be exhausted at the end of the day. Colorno also has they call them the Buffali, which is a inclusive rugby team for got mostly guys, few girls with disabilities. So again, being responsible for that, the breadth of I was their first ever director of rugby, and the breadth of that role was just enormous, and the amount of emotional, physical energy, but emotional energy that took was huge. One of the reasons I left the RFU was because I wanted to get back into coaching on the grass, but I actually found that was virtually impossible to do when I became a director of rugby.
Yeah, I mean, even listening to that, I'm exhausted. So I can imagine actually living it would have been super challenging. And how do you put your different hats on in that role? Because, like you said, you've probably got one bit where, the men's team, if it's fully professional, has a level of resource and expectation and ultimately performance, because that's what it is. Then there probably becomes a tier down to the women's side. Whereas if it's semi-professional, obviously there is a element of performance there, but equally, some of them are going to go and have day jobs elsewhere and whatnot, and your expectations are slightly less, right down to, under sixes, where ultimately that links back to what we discussed earlier around love of the game. So from you in that role, how do you put the right hat on at the right time and yeah, how do you reflect and be aware of what's needed for that individual or that team at that moment in time?
One of the weaknesses of UK club rugby, and I think club sport cricket as well, and a little bit of what I've seen in soccer, is keen dad coaches in the UK. and keen dad um, follows his son or daughter up through the age groups. So instead of being from 8 to under 18, instead of being a coach with 10 years experience of coaching, they're a novice coach because they've had 1 year of coaching 10s, 1 year of coaching 11s, and they've had to. In Italy, when I came to Colorno and here at Pesaro, there is no school sport, which is an advantage and a disadvantage, but it's an advantage in that there is money available for clubs to provide the sport for the kids. And that means that there are professional coaches available, people who are paid to do what they do. And at Colorno and here at Pesaro, with our under-16 coaches, we've got, with payment comes accountability. You have a far greater, it's very easy to influence somebody if you're paying them, because it becomes their job, and you're not speaking to a dad who has a different set of things that he's looking, things that he wants from the experience. So having professional coaches who stick with the under-16s, they've got 4 or 5 years of experience of working with 16-year-olds, which is really valuable. And the under-8s coach, has a few years. The unders, the young age group, they tend to be sports science students or people building their coaching experience. Very often they're also players, but people building their rugby experience. So it's much easier to have formal meetings than it is with volunteers and speak to them about the direction we're going. The thing about you can be have different measures of success, but as a club, what we did was have a single set of values by which each age group was kind of measured by. So when I first arrived at Colorno, Dave Lind, the Irish guy, helped me with this because my language skills weren't good enough. But we got all the parents and all the players at each age group from under 6 right the way through to seniors to sit in a room for half an hour and talk about what rugby meant to them and why they did it and what were the good things. And out of all the words we wrote them to write, I can't remember exactly how we did it, but 5 words that things they felt when they went to the rugby club, all those what they wanted from the club. We created a great big word cloud, and from that word cloud came a set of values that were adopted, and each club member wears a pair of socks with the values written down them. So those values are common from the men's team, right, with international players now playing right the way through to the under 6s, which creates a sense of one club as well.
Yeah, I think the sock thing's a really nice idea as well. You said it's something that carries through. There's lots of tidbits in terms of that. You've got the New Zealand All Blacks legacy. They discuss leaving the jersey in a better place if you found it and whatnot. And it's a similar principle in terms of, exhibiting these values. In terms of, I guess, the philosophy around style of play or how you want teams to play, what does that look like for you? Is that situational based? Is that dependent on where you are, or is there a certain belief, I guess, from a tack point? And I know we're probably 45 minutes into this conversation. It's actually the first time we've spoken about anything in that context. But is there a particular way that you believe rugby should be played, or is it very context specific?
So there is a way I believe the game should be played, and I think in the junior age group, we coach the action before we coach the decision, whereas actually in a game the decision comes first. So getting coaches to be to feedback. I ask my coaches to feedback you'll see somebody, a support runner, make a great line, running close, superb support line, great decision, and drop the ball. And the coaches will focus on the dropped ball, the execution, rather than give any kind of a recognition to the decision that the player made. So I ask all my coaches to feedback just as much on the decision as the execution of the skill. So that's some, that's a kind of thing. And one of the things that I and Phil Kearns and Andy Webb, who I worked with, we all with John Lawn as well. His support. We was a game zone and a skill zone where you have a game going on. Let's say you've got 15 players training, and you've got an objective for the game. You'll play a small game, 5v5, 6v4 in the game zone. And in the skill zone, you'll have a little game, a little activity going on, which really isolates the objective that you're trying to get across. And then after a few minutes, the players leave the skill zone and work in a rotation, leave the skill zone and immediately apply in a game the skill that they've just been working on. So that recognition. So the game zone, skill zone became fundamental, or becomes fundamental in producing players with the technical skills, but also with the contextual skills. I had an issue with, we went in the early 2000s from being too technical. Brian Ashton was an England coach who was very much, Pierre Villepoix, a French coach, was very much about jouer, play the game. But I found here as director of rugby, particularly in Italy, where fewer children grow up actually catching a ball and making tackles and that kind of stuff, you do have to spend some time on, and they don't see the game on the TV as often as they do in the UK. You have to spend more time on the technical side of things. So really, that game zone, skill zone became fundamental in the kids growing up. When you come to a performance team, managing, put simplistically, you have an idea of what your perfect game looks like, and you have what you've got, the players you've got, and the art of coaching is using all the tools that you have in putting those two together, making your perfect game, making the players you've got able to play your perfect game. Now, with professional rugby, obviously, in a professional club, you sign players that kind of, and you sign coaches who can deliver what you're looking for. So it's a little bit more scientific there.
I guess from a recruitment perspective, like that's going to be part of your role, as you mentioned there, of signing coaches that can fulfill that, or signing players that can fulfill that. How do you go around identifying individuals that are capable of doing that, and then also, potentially more importantly, doing it in a way that they uphold the values of the club? Because at times I'd imagine you've probably got a player. I look at someone like Maro Itoje in football. He might exhibit a lot of the fundamentals that you want in a footballer, but his attitude at points puts you in a perspective where I probably wouldn't want him near my football team. So yeah, how do you go around identifying individuals that, one, fit the bill from a tap point of view, but then two, are also in a position to uphold the values that you and the club believe are important?
So Stuart Lancaster always used to say that culture comes before performance. Knowing the culture that you've got, and understanding the culture that you already have is really important. For me, obviously, coming into a club in a different country, you inherit a culture. Changing that culture isn't always easy. It's virtually impossible, because most cultures reflect the society around them. Most sporting cultures, very often, certainly in Italy, reflect the society around them. So you have to find ways of understanding the culture and why it is. In terms of players who will then fit in with that culture, um, there's lots of uh, theories on this. The All Blacks you mentioned before is just no dickheads, but what a dickhead looks like, or whether somebody is a dickhead, is sometimes quite difficult. I've been around on, been around a long time. This is going to sound terrible, but usually within a couple of minutes of meeting somebody, I get a gut feeling as to whether they're going to fit in, A, with me, whether I like the person, but A, whether they're going to, how they're going to fit in with the other people around in the group and with the coaches we've got and with the environment I've got. And I can very seldom articulate that. I spend quite a lot of time persuading myself that's unfair and it's wrong, but it it usually, I maybe it's confirmation of bias, but I usually, I trust that. I trust how I feel about people and how I feel about things and how people make me feel. um, there's I try and have a meeting. It's difficult when we've got a couple of, well, we've got a player coming over from Argentina. You do Zoom calls, but you can't actually see the body language. There are lots of little indicators. If you visit a player, so we had a guy think we've signed him, think he's going to be a really good guy. Came with his mum and dad. He's 25. Came with his mum and dad, and we had dinner. And you just look. I'm reflecting now. This was on Monday, but does he help his mum, pass the water across the lunch table? Does he look after other people around him? Just little indicator, or is he self-obsessed? Is he just all about him? There's little things like that that you can pick up on. And the other side of that is there's always room for mavericks. There's always room for manageable mavericks. Showing my age, my first ever hero in sport was George Best, who I would, in 1968, I was 8 years old, and I just wondered at his skills were just absolutely outstanding. 1972, I was 12 years old, 13 years old, and he was sleeping with Miss Worlds and things like that. And again, I just wondered is it, at that age, you kind of couldn't admire the bloke enough. What he brought to a team and what he took from a team, I don't know, as a modern coach, there wouldn't perhaps be a place for somebody like that. Especially in a game like rugby, where team is so important. The fullback winger can only score after the prop has done the hard yards. But there is always for me a place for the maverick. It's just recognizing, doing a cost benefit analysis.
Yeah, and I guess it's one of those where if you've got the culture well ingrained enough around that maverick, the boundaries they do test, the team will probably rein them in to a degree and say,
Mm.
listen, we'll accept, maybe you not be fully engaged with this part of the program, but this part's a non-negotiable, and
Yeah.
allow them to do that. And it's a really interesting premise because I listen to a lot of different podcasts, and I think the thing about the Maverick is you almost expect them to be a Maverick on the pitch, but then to be completely conformist off it. And it's like,
Mm.
well, actually, the two probably go in hand if they're willing to do the things that no one else is either brave enough to do or sees on it. It's probably because off it they're going to do similar and go off and do some Maverick type stuff. So I think that's really really interesting. Second to last question for me, which is obviously over your career you would have worked with a lot of I imagine, high-profile individuals and a lot of successful individuals, both from a coaching perspective and a playing perspective. If I was to press you on some key characteristics or key threads that you've seen from those that go on to have success, is there anything that particularly springs to mind where you think, actually, I believe that's a common denominator of those that have gone on to have real high level of success?
I think there is one key thing I would say, and that's honesty. And when I say honesty, it's no excuses. You look at a lot of sportsmen and coaches who look for excuses, not reasons, and the ability to self-reflect honestly for me is hugely important. I'm the world's worst. And it's a little bit about self-management as well, because if we've lost a game, and usually when we've lost a game, I'm angry for about 10 minutes. So I go and collect up the tackle shields. I shake hands with the referee, and then I go and collect up the tackle shields, rage at rage at everything internally for about 10 minutes, and then I'm fine. Then I'm okay. And then I can go away and I can work out the real reasons why this happened. People who can't let that go, who have that innate desire to find an excuse, are people for me who I don't have a huge amount of time for.
No, I think that makes complete sense. And with your character here, it sounds like there's a big reflection piece, be it being in a tractor for 12 hours and considering conversations through to this now. So I think that's probably a premise that's worked this way through. So last question for me, which is, if I were to speak to either the people you work with or the players you coached or coach, etc., how would you hope they described you in 3 words, and why?
Well, I would hope it would be thoughtful. I hope it would be creative, and I hope it would be supportive.
Perfect. Think, real great conversation with lots of interesting avenues to go down. There's plenty more we could have discussed, but maybe a second one of these is due a lot further down the line. But I hope that Italy keeps its sunshine, and hopefully you can send some over across to the UK. And I will catch up with you again soon.
Okay, ciao.
Thanks for listening to the Sports Initiative podcast with me, Michael Wright. Please remember to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at the Sports Initiative Podcast, and share this podcast with friends and family. I'll see you next week.